Hello, I'm Neil Mackenzie, a professional wine merchant and wine expert, and I'm here to guide you through your wine pack that you've recently purchased. In this wine pack, you'll also find details of how to actually buy these wines should you want to perhaps use them for further study. So without further ado, let's get started. One of my favourite wines from Burgundy is Chablis, and Chablis comes from the far most northern region of Burgundy. Being quite far north, of course, it's quite cold, a cold climate. So for that reason, the winemakers have to be quite canny when making their wines. One of the biggest problems there is frost. So most of the vineyards will be planted on south-facing slopes to make sure that they maximise the amount of sunlight. Chablis, when I say it's far north, is way, way away from the Cote d'Or, where of course you have the big, powerful red wines of the Cote de Nuits, and further to the south, the Cote de Beaune, these wonderful, rich, opulent white wines. Chablis, of course, is very different. It's much more steely, much crisper, much more appley. Very different style of wine. But like all white Burgundy, it's made from 100% Chardonnay. So let's look at the wine. Chablis, this one here, is actually made by Domaine Gautheron, a very small family estate, only produce about 20,000 cases a year, outside the village of Flay, very close to Chablis town itself. So let's taste the wine. Well, the most important thing, of course, before we do anything is to make sure it's in good condition. Well, it's certainly clean and bright. It's got a lovely greenish tinge to the colour. And on the nose, wonderfully appley and zesty, just as Chablis should be. A little bit of floral touch there too. And on the palate, which of course we all like to get stuck into, lovely citrusy, again appley. My mouth is watering like crazy, which tells me there's great acidity there. A wine that isn't that well made, you'll taste the acid straight away. But when the acid is in perfect balance with the fruit, you only taste the acid because your mouth is watering, and mine certainly is. This is a really well-made Chablis. It's a village Chablis, which means the vineyards are on the low-lying areas around the Chablis town itself. Obviously, there are Premier Crus and Grand Crus which climb up the slopes of Chablis, but this village Chablis, I have to say, certainly packs a punch. The big controversy in Chablis is whether to use oak or not, and this family do not use any oak at all in this wine. Maybe a touch in their old vines, but that's about it. The reason why there's so much controversy is that the traditionalists want to keep Chablis steely and fresh and lean, which means you're using stainless steel, a very modern technique. The modernists, however, want to make the wines a little bit richer, a little bit more buttery, a little bit more weight to them, so they will use a little bit of new oak. Of course, a very old-fashioned method. Rather bizarre, isn't it? Anyway, this is a very traditional style of wine. Crisp, clean, and as I said, that lovely appley fruit as well. Chablis has an amazing history, it really does. It started way back in about 800 AD, probably before anything else got going in Burgundy. The marauding Vikings made the population of the northern coast flee, and they all descended around the area of Chablis itself. The church set up and of course became very, very important, not only as a church, but also because they were the main providers of wine, usually making wine just for monastic purposes. Of course, it was a huge production. The church got even richer when you had lots of people donating land to the church. Crusaders going out on tour would often donate land just to atone for any sins that they might commit later on. Chablis continued to grow and grow and grow in popularity. Even in the 1700s, we see Chablis appearing in the London markets as well, because it was very easy to get to the Paris market. It wasn't that far a distance. Chablis continued until, of course, the French Revolution, when the whole of Burgundy, absolute chaos reigned. The vineyards were seized and they were split up into very, very small vineyard areas, which meant, of course, that a lot of the winemakers disappeared. But it survived. and of course continued until about the 1850s, when suddenly transport changed and the train arrived, and suddenly the wines from the southern Burgundy region of the Côte d'Or would appear in the Paris and the London markets, and poor old Chablis lost its crown a bit. But I have to say, to this day, it still remains one of my favourite wines. So I hope you enjoy it. Cheers. Often overlooked are the red wines from the Côte de Beaune. The wine I'd like to taste with you now is actually a Savigny-les-Beaune made by Domaine de Prieure. Savigny-les-Beaune is way up in the north of the Côte de Beaune, the Côte de Beaune being the southern half of the Côte d'Or. The Côte de Nuits to the north has all the big, powerful Pinot Noirs, wonderful wines with fantastic villages like Nuits Saint-Georges, Gevrey-Chambertin, Chambolle-Musigny, the big wines we all know of. But down in the Côte de Beaune, normally associated with white wine and of course Chardonnay, the Meursault, Chassagne, Puligny, these wonderful wines, but they also produce some great red wines, if not a little bit lighter and more delicate than the reds from the northern part of Burgundy. You all know, I'm sure, the villages of Volnay, Monthalet, Pommard, great wines just south of the town of Beaune itself. But go just north of Beaune and you have Savigny, Savigny-les-Beaune. And it's here that we have our first wine. Made, as I said, 100% from Pinot Noir, certainly a wine worth looking at. Now, let's taste it together, but before I do anything else, let's show you the bottle. Domaine de Prieure, Les Gollardes. And I'll explain what Les Gollardes is in a second, because there is often a great confusion surrounding Burgundy when you have terms on the bottle like Premier Cru or Grand Cru or village wines. I'll explain all in a second. So, let's look at the colour of this wine first. And it's got a lovely, gentle, ruby red colour here. Quite delicate, not opaque or overpowering. It's a lovely colour. And on the nose, slightly scented, perfumed, and very much that raspberry aroma you associate with Pinot Noir. And on the palate, lovely ripe fruit there with a lovely vein of acidity running right through it. My mouth's watering like mad. It's got that lovely delicate touch of blackberry as well as raspberry. A really, really nice flavour. And it really continues quite long as well, really going on right to the end. It's a lovely drop of wine. Domaine de Prieure is a lovely property, it really is. It's owned by Jean-Michel Maurice, who's actually the mayor of Savigny-les-Beaune, and he makes the wine with his son Stephan, who's also a renowned winemaker. They use a little bit of oak maturation, probably 12 to 18 months, but mainly old wood, very little new wood. And actually, when they're picking the grapes and they put them into the crusher, they use a few stems and stalks as well. And by doing that, you're giving a little bit more tannin to the wine, so the wine has perhaps a bit more structure. So perhaps they're quite old-fashioned in that regard. Savigny-les-Beaune, I think, offers a really delightful, lighter style of red Burgundy. The history of the place is quite extraordinary because, of course, it was here in Burgundy that we see the vineyards being set up initially by the monks. And here perhaps lies a slight problem. I mentioned earlier Les Gollardes on the label, and what that actually tells us is that it comes from a vineyard called Les Gollardes. And this is what we call a leur-dit. You've heard of Premier Cru and Grand Cru. Well, what the monks basically identified was that back in the early medieval times, that grapes grown in certain sites would give you better quality wines than just the general area and the mixing together of grapes. So these sites were very, very fiercely guarded. Of course, we now know them as Premier Cru or Grand Cru sites, depending where they are on the hills or the higher levels around these wine areas. But a leur-dit is also a particular site and really recognised for its quality of grapes. The only problem is that during the French Revolution, these vineyards were totally divided between many different growers. And what it means, of course, is that you may have 70 or 80 different people that own one vineyard site. Here in Gollardes, there are quite a few producers, so it's really important to know who the producer is. However, most producers in Les Gollardes don't have too much of a problem because it's such a great site. Most of the vines there will be 40 to 45 years old, and with that kind of age, you're beginning to get some real complexity in these wines. I hope you enjoy this wine. I know I certainly do. Cheers. One producer I've followed for many, many years in Burgundy is Alain Michelot in the Côte de Nuits, very close to Nuits Saint-Georges, a wonderful wine producer. And it's been around, well, he's certainly been around making wine since about 1966 when he inherited the property from his father. We are, of course, up in the northern part of the Côte d'Or, in the Côte de Nuits. And here we have the big, powerful reds from places like Gevrey-Chambertin, Chambolle-Musigny, Romane, and of course, Nuits Saint-Georges. Now, Nuits Saint-Georges, the red wines, like all red wine in Burgundy, is made from 100% Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir is a nightmare grape variety to grow, it really is. And although we see great success around the world in places like New Zealand, in Central Otago, Southern Australia, in Victoria, Mornington Peninsula, and indeed California, of course, I really think, and I have to say, that I think it's still at home really in the Côte de Nuits. I'm sure some of you will disagree, but let's try this wine anyway. So here we have Alain Michelot's Nuits Saint-Georges. It is in fact a Viel vin, which means of course it comes from quite old vines. So we're getting even more depth and complexity here. Let's look at the wine. In the glass it's got a really quite deep and almost opaque colour. That's a good colour for a Pinot Noir from the Côte de Nuits. Wonderful looking wine. Now on the nose, wow, some real aromas there. And when I say slightly rustic, what I mean is that there's some real big, powerful Pinot, Cassis, raspberry aromas coming out of this wine. Some lovely, lovely flavours I'm sure we're about to taste. So let's do just that now. Wow, that really is filling my mouth. Lots of acidity, and really important to have acid in a wine, because without acid you don't have the longevity to allow the wine to keep. You also don't have the structure and allowing it to balance with the fruit. So the acid is really, really important. That's a super wine and well made. And I have to say, although it's drinking really well now, I think you could put that down for another few years without any problem whatsoever. Quite a traditional winemaker, although Alain has invested quite heavily recently in his winery, and he and daughter Elodie are using some great techniques. They use a little bit of the stems and the stalks when actually putting the grapes into the crusher, so you're getting some tannin there as well. They oak their wines for maturation for about 12 to 18 months. Not too excessive, but enough to give the wine a little bit more, shall we say, structure. They use a little bit of new oak as well. And using the new oak, you're getting more phenols and more aromatics in the wine, and perhaps a little bit of silky smoothness as well. Nuits Saint-Georges has an amazing history. It goes back a long, long way. The Romans planted vines there 2,500 years ago. The term nuit doesn't actually mean night. It actually refers to nuts or walnuts, which is what the Romans grew when they were down there. And I'd like to think that they were drinking this wine with great gusto while they were munching on these walnuts. I'm sure they were. The area, though, really came to prominence probably in the late 1600s. Louis XIV, the ailing king of France, was prescribed by his doctor only to drink the wines of Nuits Saint-Georges. These were considered the only thing that would actually help his health. Now, as you can imagine, the sales of Nuits Saint-Georges absolutely soared. Unfortunately, Champagne was also competing at the time, or the area of Champagne was competing with its red Pinot Noirs, and of course sales plummeted. So good old Nuits Saint-Georges did quite well out of that doctor, I have to say. So I tend to agree with him, actually. I'm rather a Nuits Saint-Georges fan, so I'd like to raise a glass to that doctor, and cheers. Hope you enjoy that wine.